Forget everything you think you know about Viking battles. There were no slow-motion duels under the northern lights, no fearless warriors trading poetic death speeches, and no glorious music echoing across the field. The truth was far messier, louder, and far more terrifying. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in a wall of sweating, shaking men, unable to hear the war horn, your knees trembling, your shield vibrating from the first brutal hit. The ground is slick with blood and mud, men are tripping over each other, and the only plan left is simple: stay alive. Battles weren't noble contests of skill, they were chaotic storms of fear, exhaustion, and blind survival. This isn't the Viking story told in sagas. This is what really happened when warriors clashed, and today it might just change the way you see history forever. The morning was colder than anyone expected. Mist clung low to the fields, curling between the boots of men who shifted restlessly in formation. Shields rattled as nervous hands adjusted grips. No music played. No banners rippled in some glorious wind. Only the sound of men breathing shallow, shaky, impatient. This wasn't the Viking battle the sagas promised. There was no grand speech, no sudden rush of heroic fire in their chests. Just sweat, mud, and the gnawing ache of waiting. Hours of waiting. Some men muttered prayers to Odin, others cursed the chill, and more than a few quietly regretted ever stepping onto that field. Then, faintly, the horn. It wasn't loud, not the thunderous call that stories speak of. It was distant, muffled, swallowed almost instantly by the roar of voices that rose around them. The men didn't charge like the heroes of legend. They shuffled forward, shields pressed tight together, their steps uneven as fear tangled their legs. Someone stumbled in the mud and dragged two more down with him. A spear clattered against a shield. The front line lurched, then pushed again. The clash came suddenly. A shield slammed into another, the impact reverberating through bone. The man beside you shouted, though his words made no sense, just raw sound, more animal than human. And before you had time to think, the wall of enemies was there, faces twisted, mouths wide, weapons stabbing through the narrow gaps. You couldn't swing your sword, like the sagas describe. There was no room for broad strokes or elegant arcs. Instead, it was jabs, awkward and desperate, the tip of your blade darting forward like a striking snake. Axes chopped from above, but more often they snagged in wood or bone, leaving the wielder scrambling to yank them free. The crush of bodies made every movement clumsy. Men weren't fighting one-on-one, they were pushing, shoving, stabbing at shapes that blurred together. The noise was deafening, not the music of battle, but a wall of chaos, metal striking flesh, wood splintering, voices breaking into screams. Your shield arm shook violently with each impact, the bones in your wrists screaming in protest. The smell hit next: sweat, mud, iron, and blood, heavy, choking, unforgettable. A man fell to your left. He didn't die from a dramatic strike, but from losing his footing. He screamed once before, the press of bodies trampled him into the mud. You didn't look down, you couldn't. Looking down meant dying with him. And all the while, the sagas whispered lies in the back of your mind, songs of honor, of fearless warriors, of glory promised by the gods. But in that moment, there was only one truth. Battle wasn't about honor. It was about survival, and survival was slipping further away with every heartbeat. This was no heroic saga. This was the reality of a Viking battle. The battle hadn't started yet, but it already felt like hell. You stood shoulder to shoulder, shield locked against the man beside you, and every second of waiting dragged like a lifetime. The ground was soft with dew and mud, but your boots felt like they were filled with stone. Hours of standing in formation had made your knees tremble and your back ache. The weight of your shield dug deep into your arm, and the leather strap rubbed your skin raw. The men around you fidgeted, each one lost in his own private fear. Some spat into the dirt, Others gripped the hilts of their axes too tightly, their knuckles white. A few muttered prayers under their breath, half to Odin, half to anyone who might be listening. One man laughed, a strange, high-pitched laugh that cracked halfway through. Nobody joined in. The waiting was worse than the fighting. At least in the fight, you knew what to do: swing, block, survive. Here, in the silence before the clash, there was nothing to fight but your own mind. Your thoughts spun. What if the horn never came? What if you turned and ran? What if this was the last sunrise you'd ever see? The air reeked of garlic and sweat, even before the battle began. Vikings didn't have breath mints, and the men around you had eaten heavily, stuffing themselves on whatever food they could manage that morning. Now, as they breathed heavily in the tight formation, the stench hit you like a second enemy. You angled your head slightly just to catch a whiff of fresh air. Somewhere in the back ranks, a man vomited. The sound rippled through the formation, followed by nervous chuckles that died as quickly as they started. Everyone knew the truth: any one of them might be next. The hornblower was far behind you, safe with the leaders, his job to signal the attack, but his sound was faint at best. In the crush of voices, clashing shields, and pounding hearts, who could hear him? Most men would never know the official moment the battle began. They would simply be pushed forward, swept along by the human tide, or shoved into the fight by the weight of men behind them. Your hand tightened on your weapon. The wood of the spear shaft felt slick with sweat. You rehearsed the first motion in your head: jab forward, shield up, jab again. Simple. Rehearse it enough. Maybe you'd live long enough to remember the rest of the plan. Minutes stretched. The fog began to thin, revealing shapes on the horizon. Shields, spears, the enemy line, growing clearer with every heartbeat. They were just men like you, but in the mist they looked like giants, like shadows from some other world. Someone shouted down the line, whether a prayer or a curse, you couldn't tell. The men shifted, leaning forward, pressing their shields tighter. And then it came, the horn, distant, muffled, but undeniable. The waiting was over. The horn's call faded, almost instantly, into the roar of voices. It wasn't a neat, disciplined cry like in the sagas. It was chaos. 1,000 throats screaming all at once, some shouting prayers, others curses, and most just letting raw fear spill out of their lungs. The ground shook as men pushed forward, not in the heroic sprint of legends, but in a stumbling, shuffling surge. Your boots sank into mud with every step. The man ahead of you slipped, his shield jerking sideways as he tried to recover. You had to shove him back into line to keep from tripping yourself. The formation wavered like a drunken wave, surging forward, then collapsing inward as bodies pressed too close. Your shield rattled under the weight of those behind you, shoving you onward. You wanted to hold back, to breathe, but the line didn't care. It forced you forward whether you were ready or not. The enemy grew larger, closer shapes becoming faces, faces twisted into masks of rage and terror. Their shields locked tight just like yours, their weapons jutting forward like a wall of thorns. For a heartbeat, it felt impossible. How could flesh and bone break through that wall of wood and iron? Then came the crash. The sound wasn't one noise, it was hundreds, layered on top of each other. Shields slamming, wood cracking, metal striking metal, men grunting as the impact knocked the wind from their lungs. The vibration shot down your arm, rattling your bones. Your teeth clacked together hard enough to sting. The press was overwhelming. You weren't fighting, yet you were being crushed. Your shield was your world now, jammed against the enemy's, pressed against your neighbours, everything locked in one heaving, straining mass. Breath came in short bursts, hot and sour with the stink of men around you. Someone's hair brushed your cheek. Another man's spit hit your arm as he screamed. And then the weapons slid in. A spear darted past your shield edge, glancing off your shoulder. Another jabbed from above, forcing you to duck. You thrust your own weapon forward, blindly, feeling it strike something wood, flesh? You didn't know. There was no clean duel, no clear target, just shapes, arms, blades, shadows, moving in and out of reach. The man beside you roared and shoved, his shield ramming forward. For a moment, the enemy line buckled, stumbling back a step. You pushed with him, adding your weight, your shoulder screaming with the effort. But the line surged again, harder, and you nearly lost your footing. Someone fell behind you. You heard the cry, sharp and desperate, then cut off as the press of bodies closed over him. You didn't turn. You couldn't. Turning meant opening a gap in the wall, and a gap meant death. Your shield shook again, harder this time. Splinters bit into your hand where the edge cracked. You shoved forward, teeth bared, and screamed not words, just noise, joining the chorus of 1,000 others. The charge wasn't heroic. It wasn't glorious. It was stumbling, shoving, screaming chaos, and it had only just begun. The first men to die didn't fall with glory. They never even swung their axes. Some stumbled as the lines clashed, their feet sinking into the slick earth. One misstep was enough. A man tripped over a root or a body already lying on the ground, and suddenly he was down. Once you hit the mud in the crush of battle, you might as well have been swallowed by the sea. The shield wall didn't stop for the fallen. It couldn't. The mass behind kept pushing, driving everyone forward like a tide that had no mercy. If you went down, you were trampled under boots, crushed beneath shields, and pinned in place by the weight of men who never even saw your face. You screamed, but your voice vanished in the roar. A soldier, just ahead of you, slipped on the wet grass. You saw his arms pinwheel, his shield tearing away from the line. He fell backward, eyes wide, mouth open. The men behind tried to step over him, but the press was too heavy. In seconds, his body disappeared beneath the wave. When the line lurched forward again, he was gone, swallowed by the mud and feet of 100 warriors. Others fell because their bodies betrayed them. The fear was too much, the shaking knees, the weak stomach, the blinding dizziness. Men fainted before the clash, their minds shutting down before the first blade touched them, and down they went, lost to the stampede. You heard bones crack beneath the weight, a muffled scream, a hand clawing out from below, fingers caked in blood and earth, only to vanish again as the next shove drove everyone tighter together. Even those who stood could fall in an instant. The impact of shield on shield knocked men off balance, throwing them backward or sideways. A single slip could leave a gap in the wall, and the enemy's spear was quick to find it. Sometimes it wasn't the strongest fighter who died first. It was the one who simply stood at the wrong angle when the push came. You tried not to look down. You couldn't afford to. Every glance at the ground was a chance for a spear to slip past your guard, but you heard it. The crunch of ribs, the muffled cries fading fast, the churn of mud swallowing men alive. The sagas never told it this way. They spoke of warriors cutting each other down in great duels, of champions clashing under the eyes of gods. They didn't sing about the ones who suffocated in the mud, who never even raised a blade, who died not from skill or steel, but from the merciless crush of men and earth. And yet, for every warrior who raised his sword, there were others already gone. The battle claimed its first victims before the true fight had even begun. You couldn't see much anymore. The wall of shields pressed so close that the world shrank to the few inches of space in front of your face. Sight gave way to sound, to touch, and worst of all, to smell. The air was already thick, hot, and suffocating. Every man around you was sweating, panting, shouting, their breaths mixing into a cloud that clung to your lungs. Each inhale brought a different stench, the sour tang of unwashed wool, the metallic bite of blood, the reek of damp leather. But above it all was the stink of breath, garlic. It rolled off the man next to you in waves, clinging to his beard, carried on every rasping shout he forced into the air. Vikings ate it to ward off sickness, to strengthen the body, or so they believed. But here, packed shoulder to shoulder, it only made the suffocating press worse. Every exhale was a foul, sharp blast of rot that burned your nose and throat. You gagged, swallowing it down, trying not to choke as the wall shoved forward again. The press of bodies was relentless. Shoulders slammed against yours, ribs grinding together, men gasping into your ear. There was no space for comfort, no space for air. Your shield dug into your chest as you pushed, every breath shallow, stolen. A moment of panic clawed at your throat. You couldn't breathe. Not enough, but the tide of battle gave no mercy. You forced yourself to suck in another lungful of heat and stink. Someone coughed beside you, a wet, ragged hack that sprayed spittle across your cheek. Another man grunted so close you felt his beard brush your neck. The taste of iron rose in your mouth, blood, yours or theirs, you couldn't tell. The sagas never spoke of this. They didn't tell of the stink of men penned in like cattle, of the sour breath and garlic that clung to the air thicker than smoke. They sang of Odin's warriors, fierce and shining, not of the stench that made your stomach twist. A spearhead jabbed past your shield, and you lurched sideways, bumping hard into your neighbour. His sweat ran down your arm, hot and sticky. He snarled in your face, his teeth yellow, his breath a blast of rot and bile. You shoved back into place, gasping, trying not to vomit. Still the wall pressed, still the air grew fouler. You weren't just fighting the enemy now, you were fighting the press of bodies, the choke of stink, the rising panic in your chest that begged you to run, to claw your way free. But there was nowhere to run. Only forward, into the reeking wall of men and shields and death. And so, you breathed. Fear, sweat, garlic. The scent of battle, not sung in songs, but carried in every desperate breath. It began low, like thunder far off. A rumble from deep in men's chests, rising, growing, echoing through the shield wall. Dozens of voices first, then hundreds, then thousands. The sound rolled across the field until it no longer felt like men shouting, it felt like the earth itself was screaming. You joined in because you had to. Not shouting was worse than silence. To stay quiet meant standing apart, and in the crush of war, standing apart meant death. So you opened your throat and roared with the rest, your voice lost in the storm, your lungs burning with the effort. The sound was not words, not speeches, not poetry, just noise, raw, brutal, and endless. A howl to drown fear, to smother the panic rising in your gut, to convince yourself you were not a man about to die, but part of something greater, something unstoppable. The enemy shouted back. Their roar clashed with yours in the air between you, two storms colliding. The field shook with it. The birds fled. The ground seemed to tremble. For a heartbeat, the battle was nothing but voices, two walls of men trying to break each other with sound before steel even touched flesh. The noise became a weapon. The sagas told of sharpened blades and great warriors, but they did not speak of this, the roar that stripped the soul bare. It rattled your skull, made your teeth ache, pounded in your chest until your heart forgot its rhythm. The enemy wasn't just in front of you, they were in your ears, in your bones, in your very breath. Beside you, a man screamed so hard the veins stood out in his neck, his spit spraying across his beard. Another slammed his shield with the edge of his sword, the bang like thunder in the press. You copied him, slamming your own, the shock running through your arm, feeding the frenzy. The wall became a drum, each strike another beat in the storm. The air was fire in your throat. Your voice cracked, failed, but it didn't matter. No one heard you, no one could. The roar was too vast, too all-consuming. It drowned thought, it drowned fear, it drowned the sound of your own breath until you felt less like a man and more like a beast, a creature of noise and rage. And then it changed. The roar didn't fade. It broke shattered by the crash of shield against shield, by the splintering of wood and the shriek of iron. For a heartbeat, the noise of men became the noise of war. The shouts became screams. The wall of voices had done its work. Now came the wall of blood. The roar ended in violence. Two walls of men, shields locked, spears jutting, feet pounding the earth, then the crash. It was like two ships colliding at sea, wood groaning, iron screeching, bodies slamming together with a force that knocked the air from your lungs. The impact rattled your bones. Your shield slammed against your chest as the enemy's weight drove into it, your teeth clacking together, your arms trembling under the sudden force. The press was instant. No space, no breath, no time. The enemy was no longer out there. He was here, inches away, snarling, sweating, striking. The sound changed. Gone were the roars. Now came the chaos, splintering wood, screaming men, the hiss of blades dragging against shields, the crunch of bone under iron. Every sound was sharp, violent, final. A spear punched through a gap in the wall ahead. It scraped across your neighbour's shield and sank into his shoulder. He bellowed, blood spraying, but the wall did not break. He held, teeth bared, blood running down his arm, his shield still locked against yours. There was no time to pull back, no space to fall away. The shield wall was a prison, and you were locked inside it. The enemy shoved again, driving forward, and your feet slid back through the mud. You shoved in return, digging your boots deep, every muscle straining to push the wall forward an inch. It was not glory. It was not sword against sword. It was weight against weight, man against man, each heartbeat a test of strength, of endurance, of sheer will not to collapse. The first real death you saw came fast. A man just 2 steps down from you raised his head too high, and a spear found his throat. He gagged, the sound wet and horrible, and went limp. But there was nowhere for him to fall. His body sagged, still held upright by the crush of men, his lifeless eyes staring into nothing as blood poured down his tunic. The shield wall swallowed him whole, still moving, still fighting, his corpse pinned upright like a puppet with its strings cut. You grunted, sweat running into your eyes, the weight of the shield digging into your shoulder. The enemy's breath hit your face, sour and hot, as he snarled and shoved again. Your own roar tore free without thought, a sound as much survival as rage. The impact wasn't over. It wasn't a single crash. It was a storm, rolling, breaking, smashing again and again. Each shove rattled your bones, each strike hammered at your arms. The shield wall was no longer just a formation, it was a living thing, groaning, snarling, consuming men by the heartbeat. And in that moment, you understood. The battle was not won with swords, not yet. The first fight was survival of the wall. Hold the line or be crushed beneath it. The crash of the first impact was only the beginning. Now came the greater battle, simply staying on your feet. Every shove, every push, every stumble threatened to drag you down into the mud, and in the shield wall, falling was death. A man who dropped was not helped up. There was no room, no pause, no mercy. If you slipped, the wall rolled over you, and the boots of friend and foe alike crushed you into the earth. You felt the ground shift under your heels as another wave of pressure slammed into the line. Your legs shook, knees bending dangerously. You fought to steady yourself, driving your boots deeper into the muck. The man beside you faltered, slipping for half a heartbeat before ramming his shield back into place, his eyes wide with the terror of what nearly happened. Then someone did fall. Just 3 men down, a warrior screamed as the press drove him backward. His shield tilted, his knees buckled, and he disappeared beneath the line. The sound of his cries vanished instantly, muffled under the wall of men. The space where he had stood was closed within seconds, his comrades locking tighter, filling the gap, but you knew he was still there, crushed beneath hundreds of pounds of armor, flesh, and mud. His death would be slow, suffocating, unseen. The fear of falling was worse than the fear of steel. You could block a sword, dodge a spear, but the earth, the weight of the wall? That enemy was merciless. Your thighs burned as you braced, every muscle straining. Your arms ached from holding the shield, the wood vibrating with every strike. Sweat stung your eyes, mixing with the sting of blood where the rim of your helmet had cut into your brow. The enemy shoved again, a great heave of shoulders and shields. You bent with it, not against it, letting the wave roll through you. You had learned, even in these few minutes, that resistance could topple you, flex, bend, push back only when you had ground under your feet. This was not the heroics of sagas. It was balance, rhythm, survival. A man to your left lost it, his shield tipped high, exposing his legs, and in an instant a spear darted through the gap. The iron point buried itself in his thigh, and he screamed, crumpling downward. He tried to stand again, dragging himself upright, but the wall was unforgiving. He slipped once more, vanishing under the feet of both sides. His scream ended in a gurgle. The mud beneath you was slick now, water, earth, and blood mixing into a treacherous sludge. Each step was half a battle, each breath a labour. But you clenched your jaw, tightened your grip, and forced your legs to hold. To fall was to die. And above all the screams and clangor, one thought beat in your skull like a drum: stay standing. The battle was less than 10 minutes old, but your body felt as if it had already endured hours. The weight of the shield dragged at your arm. Your breath tore through your chest, each gasp loud in your ears but swallowed by the roar all around you. The heat was suffocating, not from the sun, but from the crush of men, the steam of sweat and blood pressed together in one writhing mass. Your helmet trapped it all. The iron grew slick against your skin, and each breath filled your lungs with the stench of iron, leather, and fear. You could smell everything: the sour tang of vomit, the acrid reek of unwashed bodies, the sharp copper of blood. It was overwhelming, dizzying, as though the air itself was poisoned. Your throat burned. You tried to swallow, but your mouth was dry. Even water, carried in skins before the battle, was forgotten now. There was no pause, no chance to sip. Every moment was consumed by survival. Beside you, a warrior ripped his helmet off, gasping for air. In that instant, a spear punched over the shield line and skewered his cheek. He screamed, stumbling, his helmet falling into the mud. He clutched his face, blood gushing between his fingers, but the wall closed around him, forcing him upright. He had no choice but to fight blind with one good eye, spitting blood as he struggled to breathe. The sweat on your own brow dripped into your eyes, blurring your vision. You blinked furiously, raising your arm just enough to swipe the salt away. For that heartbeat, your shield sagged, and the enemy slammed into it, nearly knocking it from your grip. You recovered just in time, but your arms trembled, weaker now than when the battle began. Men coughed and spat, choking on the heat, the dust, the smoke of fires burning somewhere beyond the field. One man gagged violently, retching as bile poured from his mouth, splattering the shield of the warrior before him. No one looked, no one cared. The fight did not pause for sickness. And through it all, the sweat poured. It soaked your tunic, dripped down your legs, filled your boots. It mixed with mud and blood, turning every step into a squelch. The shield wall was not only a weapon, it was a furnace, and every man inside was being burned alive by his own body. You had thought wounds would kill you. But here, in the storm of heat and noise, you realized something else. Exhaustion could slay just as quickly as steel. If your arms dropped, if your knees buckled, if the sweat blinded you at the wrong moment, you were finished. The sagas spoke of warriors who fought for hours. Standing here, drowning in your own sweat, you knew the truth. No man fought for hours, men fought for minutes, and those minutes felt like eternity. Your shield was heavy, but the man beside you made it bearable. His rim locked into yours, his weight pressed into your shoulder, his rhythm matched your own. Without him, the line would crumble. Alone, you were nothing. Together, you were the wall. Every strike against your shield was felt in your bones, but half that force was absorbed by your neighbours. When you staggered, he steadied you. When he faltered, you leaned in harder. It was not friendship, it was survival. There was no space for glory here, no heroic duels. You could not swing freely, you could not step boldly. The crush of men meant your arm had only inches to move, your blade darting out like a snake before being yanked back in. Too wide a swing, and you'd carve your own ally instead of your enemy. One man forgot that. He lunged forward, eager, his sword sweeping too far. In an instant, the line broke. A gap opened wide enough for an enemy spear to thrust through, catching him in the gut. His scream echoed, but worse than his death was the space he left behind. Shields buckled, shoulders stumbled, and the entire section bent inward. Only with desperate shoving and cursing did the warriors close the hole again, stamping their boots and slamming shields until the wall was whole. You learned quickly. Discipline mattered more than courage. You had to trust the men on either side, even if you barely knew their names. You leaned on them as much as they leaned on you. One misstep, one man breaking formation, and all of you were corpses. The enemy pressed harder now, their shields slamming into yours, their spears darting like wasps through every crack. You raised your shield just in time to deflect a thrust, but the man to your right saved your life without even looking at you, his sword stabbing low, driving the enemy weapon aside before it pierced your thigh. You didn't thank him. There was no time for words. He had done what the wall demanded, just as you would for him. At times, the press was so tight, you could feel their hearts pounding through their armor. Their sweat smeared against your arm, their breath hot in your ear. When one shifted, all shifted. When one braced, all braced. You were no longer a single man. You were part of a machine of flesh and wood and steel, grinding against its twin on the other side of the field. And in that grinding machine, mercy was impossible. A wounded man who slumped threatened everyone. If he sagged too far, the wall itself could break. More than once, you heard the snarled curses of comrades, forcing a half-dead warrior back to his feet, propping him up not out of kindness but necessity. He was a shield, nothing more. The sagas told of lone heroes cutting their way through a battlefield. But standing here, crushed between brothers, you knew the truth. Survival was never a matter of one man's strength. It was the strength of all or none. The sword. In stories, it was the weapon of kings, gleaming in firelight, flashing in graceful arcs. But in battle, it was clumsy, cramped, and far from glorious. You had no room to swing. The shield wall pressed so tightly that your arm could not stretch fully. Each strike was a jab, a desperate thrust into the smallest opening you could find an exposed thigh, a gap in mail, the face of a man foolish enough to raise his visor. The sound was not the ringing clash sung in sagas. It was dull and sickening, the thud of iron smashing against wood, the scrape of steel glancing off a helmet, the wet slap of a blade tearing flesh. Every movement risked catching your sword on a shield rim or your neighbor's arm. You aimed for what you could reach, not for what you wanted. The man in front of you jerked back as your sword grazed his helmet, the edge biting shallow. He reeled, blood dripping into his eyes, but he didn't fall. He kept swinging, blind and furious, and you had to wrench your blade free before his counterblow landed. Your grip slipped with sweat, your arms ached with every thrust. The sword felt heavier by the minute, its balance betrayed by exhaustion. You shifted it awkwardly, trying to stab low under the shield wall. The point caught in mud, stuck for an instant too long. You ripped it out just in time, narrowly avoiding disaster. Around you, men fumbled the same way. A sword was only as good as the space to wield it, and here there was none. One warrior swung too wide, striking his own ally's shield rim. The vibration rattled his hand, numbing it, and before he could recover, a spear slid under his guard and into his belly. He folded instantly, clutching his stomach, dragged down into the mud as the wall shifted over him. Some tried to raise their swords high, striking over shields. But lifting your arm too long was a gamble. The enemy could hack at your exposed side, or worse, grab your wrist and wrench the weapon from your hand. One man cried out as his blade was torn away, lost to the press of bodies. He had no time to recover, his shield sagged, and an axe split his skull. Your own strikes felt less like skill and more like desperation. There was no elegance here, no dance of warriors, just hacking, stabbing, fumbling in the crush. You were not fighting like the heroes of sagas, you were clawing for space, for breath, for survival. And still, the sword endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it was versatile. You could thrust, you could slash, you could even use the pommel as a hammer in close quarters. It was ugly, it was awkward, but it worked. The stories lied about Viking swordsmen dancing across the battlefield. The truth was simpler, harsher. Swords were not graceful tools of art. They were blunt instruments of survival, wielded clumsily in the suffocating chaos of battle. When the sword grew too heavy, when the edge dulled or stuck in bone, you didn't stop, you improvised. The sagas never spoke of it, but the truth was simple. Weapons broke, shields shattered, and men were forced to fight with whatever remained in their hands. Sometimes that meant turning a blade around, gripping it by the edge, and smashing with the pommel or the crossguard. A murder stroke, the masters called it centuries later. In the crush of the shield wall, it was less a technique than desperation. You found yourself choking up on the grip of your sword, driving the guard into the enemy's face like a hammer. Metal crunched against teeth and nose, the man screaming as his shield slipped. There was no finesse, no elegance, just the raw need to hurt him before he hurt you. The shield itself became a weapon. You slammed it forward, not to block, but to break. The iron boss at its center drove into the enemy's chest, ribs cracking beneath the impact. He stumbled back, and only then could you thrust your blade into the gap. When men lost their swords entirely, they didn't step back. They swung with hilts, with daggers, even with rocks snatched from the ground. One man beside you had lost his weapon hours ago. He clutched the splintered haft of a spear, jagged and sharp, and drove it again and again into the belly of whoever pressed too close. Each thrust was short and brutal, like a butcher's work. The hammer blows came next. Axes were made for wood as much as flesh, and when their edges dulled, warriors simply flipped them and smashed with the back. You watched one Norseman bring the hammer side of his axe down on a helmet, caving the iron inward with a sickening thud. The man beneath twitched once, then collapsed, swallowed by the mud. Every strike was ugly, every motion born of exhaustion. There was no art left. You weren't fighting with weapons anymore. You were fighting with bones, with iron lumps, with anything that could shatter another man's body. And the noise, it was worse now. No ringing steel, just the muffled crunch of blunt iron crushing into flesh, the groan of men being broken apart. You felt each impact in your arms, in your chest, in your teeth. Fighting was not a storm of flashing blades. It was a slog of hammer blows, one after another, until someone finally dropped. At some point, your sword's edge curled, dented beyond use. You barely noticed. You flipped it in your grip and began striking with the crossguard, stabbing with the tip when you could. Each movement was clumsy, instinctive, and it was enough. The sagas never told this part. They spoke of shining blades, of clean kills. But in truth, Viking battles often ended in murder strokes and hammer blows, the language of men too tired to care about glory. Men who had only one thought left: kill or be killed. Before you saw anything, before you understood the chaos, the smell hit you. It was everywhere, woven into the air like a suffocating fog. Sweat poured off every man, soaking wool and leather, sour and sharp as it baked under the weight of armor. The stink of unwashed bodies pressed so close together was enough to turn your stomach before the first blade even struck. Then came the iron, blood spilled early, bright and hot, metallic as it sprayed across shields and faces. It clung to you, a sticky film that stank as soon as it hit the air. The copper tang filled your nostrils, coated your tongue, and never left, no matter how you gagged or spit. Mud made it worse. The ground beneath your boots had turned soft with trampling feet, churned with dirt, piss, and the guts of men who'd already fallen. Each step sank into a foul stew of earth and flesh, and when you pulled your foot free, the reek of decay followed. The smell of fear was everywhere too. You could actually smell its sour breath, bitter sweat, the acrid stench of men who'd lost control of their bowels in the press. No one laughed at it, no one mocked it. Everyone knew it could be them next. And then, the fire. Torches burned at the edges of the field, smoke drifting low across the ranks. The acrid bite of pitch and ash mixed with the rest, until every breath was agony. You coughed, gagged, swallowed bile, but still, you had to keep fighting. The worst came later, when the battle dragged on and bodies piled high. Warm corpses, cooling in the mud, began to rot faster than you could imagine. Bowels split open, spilling their contents. Stomachs bloated and burst under trampling boots. The air thickened with the stench of death, sweet, sick, impossible to escape. You could not ignore it. It filled your mouth, your lungs, your very skin. When you finally staggered back from the shield wall for a breath of air, it followed you, clinging to your clothes, your hair, your beard. There was no clean breath, not on that field. The sagas never told this truth. They wrote of heroes, of shining steel and noble deaths, but they never told of the stink, of the way your stomach churned until you thought you'd vomit inside your own helmet. They never told of the flies, already gathering on the bodies, even as men still fought. If the sound of battle broke your courage, the stench crushed your spirit. It reminded you with every breath that this was not glory, not honor. It was filth. It was rot. It was death, waiting its turn. And it stayed with you. Even years later, warriors spoke of it. Not the clang of swords, not the thrill of victory, but the stench of battle. That was the memory that never left. You had no space, no air, no freedom. The moment the two lines slammed together, you were locked into a prison of flesh and wood. Your shield pressed hard against the man before you, while the warrior behind shoved into your back, forcing you forward whether you wanted it or not. You couldn't step away. You couldn't even shift your feet. You were caught in the press. The sagas made it sound like duels one man against another, blades flashing freely, but battles weren't fought in open space. They were fought shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, bodies crammed so tight you could barely lift your arm. To strike, you had to stab low, jab sideways, or thrust blindly into gaps you could not see. The weight was unbearable. Each time the enemy line shoved forward, your ribs creaked under the pressure. Your lungs burned as you struggled for breath, your mouth sucking in air that wasn't there. You could hear men wheezing, choking, coughing out pleas for space that never came. Some collapsed where they stood, their knees buckling. They didn't even fall. They were held upright by the mass of bodies until they slowly slid down, trampled underfoot. The ground only made it worse. Mud sucked at your boots, pulling you down as you tried to brace. Fallen weapons, broken shields, and corpses littered the earth beneath, hidden until your foot found them. Step wrong, and you pitched forward into the enemy line, shield ripped away, your body instantly skewered. The smell of breath pressed against your face, hot and rancid, filled your lungs as much as the air. You couldn't see the whole battle anymore, only the helmet in front of you, the flash of steel at the edges of your vision, the blood dripping down onto your arm. You weren't fighting men anymore. You were fighting the wall itself. Some men panicked. You could hear them screaming behind you, clawing at comrades to push back, to make space, to breathe. Panic spread like fire. One man shrieking could unravel a whole rank. But there was nowhere to go. Your only choices were forward into the enemy or backward into shame. Every inch was a contest. You shoved with your shield, roared with the men beside you, and felt the wall shift. The enemy gave a step, then pressed back harder, their weight slamming into yours. It was like wrestling a tide pushed too weakly, and you drowned. Push with all your might, and you dragged the enemy with you into the muck. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't noble, it was suffocation disguised as war. The press of bodies crushed strength, crushed will, crushed men until they broke. And yet, if you endured, if your shield held, if your legs stayed beneath you, you lived. That was the battle, not shining jewels under northern skies. Just the suffocating, grinding press of bodies, inch by bloody inch. There always came a moment when courage snapped. It didn't matter how brave a man had been at dawn, or how loudly he had shouted as the lines crashed together. Sooner or later, someone's nerve shattered. And once one man broke, it spread like fire in dry grass. You could feel it before you saw it. The line behind you wavered, the weight that had been driving you forward suddenly pulling back. The roar of battle turned jagged, voices shifting from defiance to panic. And then someone turned. A shield dropped, boots scrambled in the mud, and a warrior shoved his way out of the press. Running meant life, at least for a few more breaths, but turning your back in battle was no clean escape. Once the line broke, it became slaughter. The men who fled found themselves hunted. Spears jabbed into exposed backs, axes swung low into legs. The enemy surged forward with blood in their eyes, cutting down anyone who dared to run. And when one fell, he dragged down those around him, tangling legs, piling bodies, creating a trap where men stumbled and died on top of one another. Yet men still ran. Fear was stronger than pride, stronger than oaths sworn around campfires. You could see it in their eyes, wide, wild, darting for any path out of the crush. Some cast aside their shields to sprint faster, leaving themselves bare. Some screamed for mercy, though none was given. Those who stayed cursed the runners. A broken line doomed everyone still standing. The shield wall's strength was in unity. Once it thinned, gaps opened, and the enemy poured through like a flood. Men who might have lived if the wall held were cut down because others had lost their nerve. But no one could fully condemn them, because deep down, every man knew the truth. At any moment, it could be him. The press of bodies, the suffocating stench, the endless clang of steel, it broke even the strongest minds. When survival clawed louder than honor, when breath became more precious than glory, the choice seemed simple. Still, the shame lingered. In Viking society, fleeing battle was the deepest wound to a man's name. Those who ran were branded cowards, denied songs, denied the afterlife promised to warriors. To die on your feet was to be remembered. To live by running was to vanish in disgrace. And yet, as men broke and scattered, as the wall crumbled and the killing became one-sided, no one thought of honor anymore. There was only the desperate scramble for survival. The sagas spoke of heroes who fought to their last breath, who laughed in the face of death. But the battlefield told another story, a story of men who ran, tripped, screamed and begged, torn between the fear of dying now and the shame of living forever marked. That was the truth of Viking battle. Courage was rare, but desperation was everywhere. The shield was life. It was the wall between you and death. And yet, under the pounding weight of axes and the relentless thrust of spears, even the strongest shield began to fail. The sound came first, a dull crack, like ice giving way underfoot. You felt it before you saw it, the vibration of wood fibers tearing apart, the jolt running through your arm. Then the splintering spread. Chips of oak flew into the air, leather bindings tore loose. The round shield, once whole, began to unravel in your hands. There was no terror like it. With your shield intact, you were part of the wall. With your shield broken, you were naked. Every strike now cut closer. Every thrust had a gap to find. You raised the wreckage in desperation, but the enemy's blade slipped through the cracks, drawing blood. The battlefield was littered with broken shields. They fell in heaps, discarded when they could no longer serve. Some men tried to fight on with fragments, gripping what little wood remained. Others grabbed shields from the dead, dragging them from the mud to cover themselves. But each shield had only so much life, and battle ate them all. The shield wall lived and died with its shields. When too many shattered, the line became ragged. Holes opened. The wall was no longer a wall, but a patchwork of desperate men holding scraps of wood before them. The enemy surged at these weak points, driving wedges deeper, breaking apart the formation inch by inch. For those with broken shields, every heartbeat became survival. They crouched lower, ducked behind comrades, or clutched their axes with both hands, knowing they could no longer defend, only attack. Some became wild, hacking without thought, trying to kill before being killed. Others tried to retreat, stumbling back, praying to find a fallen shield to replace their own. The sagas rarely mentioned the moment a shield gave way, but in truth, this was when battles turned. Armies didn't crumble all at once. They splintered, just like their shields, one crack at a time, until nothing was left but fragments. Imagine it, a roar in your ears, splinters cutting your cheek, your arm numb from the blows raining down. You glance sideways and see your comrade's shield torn in half, his chest suddenly exposed. A spear finds him before you can react, and he falls, dragging others down with him. The line stumbles, the enemy pushes. You are left standing with nothing but wood shards in your fist. When shields splintered, battles were decided, not by heroes in shining armor, but by ordinary men holding circles of wood until they could hold no longer. The ground was no longer ground. It had turned into something alive, thick, wet, and hungry. Each step sank into mud, slick with blood. Each movement sucked at your boots, pulling you down, as if the earth itself wanted to claim you. At first, the soil had only been damp from morning dew. But as men clashed, as bodies fell, as blood poured and mingled with churned dirt, the battlefield became a swamp of death. Warriors slipped, shields crashed, axes missed their mark as footing gave way. You couldn't stand firm. Every swing cost more strength. Every stumble brought an enemy's blade closer. Fallen men didn't always die from wounds. Many drowned where they lay. Knocked into the muck, face down, unable to rise under the crush of bodies, they inhaled mud thick with iron-tasting blood until their lungs filled. Some screamed, hands clawing at the air, before being trampled into silence. The mud swallowed weapons too. Swords vanished beneath churned soil, spears snapped under boots, shields sank and were lost. Men reached desperately for dropped axes, only to grasp nothing but filth. Fighting here was not about skill or bravery, it was about endurance against a battlefield that devoured everything. The stench was unbearable, coppery blood, sweat, piss, and the reek of spilled guts mixed with the sour rot of churned earth. Every breath tasted foul. Flies already buzzed, swarming wounds and open mouths alike. Even the strongest stomach turned at the sight, yet there was no turning away. You fought in it, you fell in it, you breathed it. Exhaustion made it worse. Legs, already heavy, sank deeper each step. Pulling free meant losing rhythm, sometimes balance, sometimes life. Many warriors were cut down not by the sharp edge of steel, but by the slow drag of mud holding them still as death found them. Those who fell tried to crawl, slipping, clawing at the ground, dragging themselves through sludge as blades hacked down around them. Some pulled themselves over the corpses of others, seeking even the grim safety of a pile of the dead to escape the sucking earth below. And always, the noise never stopped. Screams mingled with splashes, the slap of mud against armor, the crunch of boots pressing men deeper. It was chaos that grew thicker with every passing heartbeat. Blood in the mud was the great equalizer. Kings and farmers, champions and boys, all bled the same color, all fell the same way, all were swallowed alike. No saga could make it glorious, No scald could turn it noble. It was filth, despair, and death. For those who lived, the memory never left. They spoke of the battle not as a clash of warriors, but as a drowning in earth and blood. For here, the field itself was a weapon, and it killed as mercilessly as any man. The shield wall was never meant to last forever. It was a wall of flesh and wood, held together by discipline, courage, and desperation. But when the weight of battle pressed too long, when the blows became too heavy, cracks appeared, and once cracks appeared, the whole wall began to buckle. At first it was subtle, a man shifting his stance, stepping back half a foot, leaving the edge of his comrade's shield exposed. The enemy noticed, a spear thrust into the gap, and the man stumbled. His neighbour leaned to cover, but his shield angle slipped. Another strike hammered in, and suddenly the tight line that had held back the storm now bent under its weight. Noise tore through the ranks, a scream as one man went down, a shout of warning as another raised his shield too high. The line rippled, shields no longer locked edge to edge. The wall wasn't solid stone anymore, it was timber straining against the tide, and the tide was winning. The enemy pushed harder, their boots pressed into the mud, their shields slammed forward, their axes hacked at wood until splinters filled the air. Each impact sent shocks down arms and backs. Men gritted their teeth, but fatigue gnawed at them, and courage alone couldn't keep shields upright. Then it happened the moment every warrior dreaded. A single man broke, maybe his shield cracked, maybe fear overcame him, maybe his legs could simply hold no more. He stepped back, just one step. But that step opened a hole, and through it the enemy surged like water through a burst dam. The shield wall folded inward. Men were cut off, surrounded, dragged down. What had been a line became chaos. Little knots of fighters, back to back, swinging wildly as enemies closed from every side. Shouts turned to screams. Orders were lost in the din. The shield wall was supposed to give strength, to let men fight as one body. But when it buckled, each man was suddenly alone. Some tried to reform, shouting for comrades to lock shields again. Others fought like cornered beasts, axes flashing, spears thrusting in frantic defense. Many simply ran, tripping over corpses and mud, casting away shields too heavy to carry in flight. Those who stayed knew the truth. Once the wall buckled, the battle was lost. Victory belonged not to those who killed the most, but to those who broke the enemy's will to stand shoulder to shoulder. And so the wall collapsed. Shields fell to the ground, trampled into splinters. Men who once fought as one were scattered, cut down in twos and threes, swallowed by the chaos. The buckling of a shield wall wasn't a moment of drama sung in sagas. It was the slow breaking of a dam, the collapse of a human fortress, and when it fell, it took everyone with it. Among all the weapons on the battlefield, none carried the same brutal reputation as the axe. It was not elegant like a sword, nor disciplined like a spear. It was a tool meant for chopping wood, breaking bone, splitting shields. In the chaos of a Viking battle, it became something more, the terror that haunted the dark corners of the fight. When an axe struck, it did not simply cut, it shattered. Shields cracked like firewood under its weight, helmets buckled, sometimes cleaving down into the skull beneath. Limbs came off in ragged bursts of blood and flesh. A sword might wound, but an axe mutilated. Men who saw one swing through the air knew that if it landed, there would be no clean ending. The sight alone inspired dread. Warriors remembered the wide, sweeping arc, the heavy thud as it landed, the way a man screamed not from pain, but from the shock of watching his own arm fall away. In the press of battle, axes carved fear as much as flesh. But they were not perfect weapons. Their strength was also their weakness. An axe needed space to swing, and in the crush of a shield wall, space was rare. Many times a man swung wide, only to find his weapon buried deep in an enemy's shield, and once stuck, it was as good as lost. A desperate fighter would tug, straining to free the blade, while another enemy's spear punched through his ribs. Others lost their grip entirely. The mud was slick, hands were sweaty, blood made the wood slippery. An axe dropped was an axe gone, swallowed by the filth beneath men's boots. No one paused to retrieve it, there was no time. Even those who held on risked disaster. A swing that missed left the wielder exposed, arms wide, guard open. Quick enemies lunged into that gap, stabbing before the axe could rise again. Many who carried axes died not from weakness, but from their weapon's own hunger for space. Still, the axe's presence never failed to unnerve. In the half-light of dawn battles, its silhouette rising above the shield line was enough to shake men's resolve. Veterans whispered of the great two-handers, the Dane axes, that could cleave through both shield and man in a single strike. Few faced one and lived to tell of it. And yet, for all its risks, the axe remained the weapon of choice for many. Not because it was practical, not because it was safe, but because it was final. In the chaos, in the mud and blood, the axe was a weapon that ended things. Axes in the dark were not just weapons, they were symbols. Symbols of fear, brutality, and the raw truth of battle, that survival was not about elegance, but about breaking the man in front of you before he broke you. The sagas sang of swords, and fear spread at the sight of axes, but the weapon that killed more men than any other was far simpler, the spear. Long, sharp, and deadly in its reach, it was the quiet reaper of the battlefield. Unlike swords, which required costly metal and careful forging, spears were everywhere. Every farmhand, every fisherman, every raider could wield one. Some were nothing more than sharpened points of iron fixed to ash wood, but in battle even the plainest spear was a killer. In the crush of the shield wall, the spear came into its own. While the front line locked shields, those behind thrust their weapons over shoulders or through gaps. The reach allowed a warrior to strike without exposing himself. One thrust, one quick jab, and a man collapsed, his throat punctured, his stomach torn. Many never even saw who struck them. The spear was not a showy weapon. It did not split shields with thunderous blows like an axe. It did not gleam like a sword passed from father to son. But in its silence lay its strength. Men fell before they even realized they were in danger. A spear's tip could dart in and out, quicker than an eye could follow. It was also versatile. Some were thrown in the first clash, darkening the sky with iron points that fell like rain. Others were wielded two-handed, driving deep into shield and flesh with the force of a hammer. The best warriors used their spears with precision, feinting low to draw a shield down, then striking high into the face or throat. But what made the spear truly deadly was how it multiplied force. A single swordsman fought one man at a time. A spearman in a line fought 3, 4, even 5 at once. While one shield wall pressed against another, ranks of spears stabbed from behind, turning the front rank into a killing ground. Men feared axes for their horror, swords for their prestige, but they died most often with a spear in their gut. It was the weapon of choice for those who wanted to live, not just be remembered. Even the great heroes of old, the jarls and kings, often carried spears. They knew the truth. A sword might win glory, but a spear won battles. And so, in the churn of mud and blood, while men shouted and shields splintered, it was the quiet thrust of a spear that ended lives. No saga sang its praise as loudly as it deserved, but the battlefield knew the spear always found its mark. If the axe was feared and the spear was common, the sword was something else entirely, a symbol. Among Viking warriors, to own a sword was not just to carry a weapon, but to carry status. These blades were expensive, requiring fine steel and skilled forging. Few farmers could afford one. Most common warriors never even touched a sword in their lifetime. The sagas sang of gleaming swords with names, as if they were living beings: Gramra, Skofnung, Tyrfingur. They were passed down through generations, treasures more than tools. A man who wore one at his side was marked as someone important, wealthy, noble, or lucky enough to claim it from a fallen foe. But the sword's reputation often outshone its use. On the battlefield, it was not the most practical weapon. It was shorter than a spear, weaker against shields than an axe. In the chaos of a shield wall, its reach was limited. Many men armed with swords used them only when the wall broke apart, when battle shifted to grappling, to single combat, to desperate fights in the mud. Yet the sword carried something no other weapon did: fear and respect. To see an opponent draw a blade was to know he was no ordinary warrior. Swords gleamed brighter, cut cleaner, and carried legends with every stroke. They were forged not just to kill, but to be remembered. Still, swords demanded skill. Unlike the hacking weight of an axe or the thrusting simplicity of a spear, the sword required finesse. Too heavy a swing left you open. Too light, a strike bounced uselessly off armor or bone. To wield a sword well was to show not only wealth, but training, practice, and time luxuries most warriors never had. And they were fragile, despite their beauty. A bad clash could nick the blade. Striking a shield rim or another sword risked bending or snapping it. Vikings carried whetstones to sharpen them constantly, but in the heat of battle, a dulled edge was dangerous. This rarity and fragility made swords prizes of war. To strip one from the hand of a fallen man was to claim not just his weapon, but his honor. Many sagas tell of warriors who cherished captured swords more than silver or gold. Owning one was proof you had not only survived, but conquered. So while axes, hacked through helmets and spears, skewered men by the dozen, swords cut deeper into memory than into flesh. They were not the tools that won Viking battles, but they were the relics carried home, sung about by skalds, and buried with their owners beneath mounds of stone. Swords were few, but in the minds of those who saw them, they were everything. Not every man who fought in a Viking battle carried a spear, an axe, or a rare sword. Many walked onto the field gripping the same tools they used to work their farms and tend their homes. War, after all, was not only for warriors. When a village was raided or a levy was called, farmers, craftsmen, and labourers stood shoulder to shoulder with seasoned fighters. And when weapons were scarce, they brought what they had. A scythe, meant to harvest barley, became a curved blade that could hook a man from his shield wall and drag him down. A sickle, small and sharp, could tear flesh as easily as it cut stalks. Wooden clubs, simple, heavy branches, or mallets used for pounding grain were swung with desperate strength, crushing skulls and bones. Even sharpened stakes, or iron-tipped tools, pulled from barns and workshops, found their way into the chaos. These makeshift weapons lacked elegance, but they were brutally effective. A hoe swung like an axe could cave in a helmet. A pitchfork, meant for hay, could impale a man just as easily as a spear. Some men even carried hammers used in carpentry or blacksmithing, their blows breaking shields and shattering bones. But these tools came with risk. A farm implement was not balanced for battle. Its weight pulled awkwardly, its handles splintered under strain, and its reach often left the wielder exposed. To step into a shield wall with nothing more than a club was to gamble your life, yet many did, because there was no choice. When the horn sounded, a man either fought with what he had or watched his home burn. There was a grim kind of irony in this. The same hands that once tilled soil or built homes now used those same instruments to take lives. A farmer who had never seen foreign shores suddenly swung his scythe, not at wheat, but at the neck of a stranger. The transformation from worker to warrior was as quick as it was brutal, and for all their awkwardness, these tools made the battlefield even more unpredictable. A professional warrior might train against spear thrusts or axe blows, but how do you defend against a wild swing from a spade or a hammer crashing in from the side? The chaos of improvised weapons broke rhythm, disrupted order, and added to the sheer unpredictability of combat. In the sagas, these men are rarely remembered. Their weapons had no names, their deaths were not sung in verse, but without them, shield walls would have been thin and villages would have fallen faster. They were the filler ranks, the desperate bodies who stood with whatever they could grasp, holding the line with nothing but courage and desperation. And in their hands, the tools of life became the tools of death. Armor was never perfect. No matter how thick the shield, how well forged the helmet, or how padded the leather, there always came a moment when protection failed. And when it did, the result was not glorious, it was horrifying. The first defense, always, was the shield. Wooden planks bound with iron rims absorbed axe blows and spear thrusts, but every strike weakened them. Edges splintered, boards cracked. After enough punishment, a shield became dead weight, its bearer left exposed. To lose your shield in a Viking battle was to lose your life's anchor. Without it, you were naked to the storm. Helmets, though rare, were prized, but even iron could not withstand repeated strikes. A heavy axe could split a helmet wide, the blow driving through metal, bone, and flesh in one stroke. The concussive force alone could kill a man, even if the blade didn't break through. Many helmets bent or dented, their sharp edges cutting into the faces they were meant to protect. Mail armor woven rings of iron was rarer still. It offered good protection against slashes, but a spear driven hard, or an axe swung with all its weight, could punch through. Even when the rings held, the body beneath was battered. Broken ribs, ruptured organs, and shattered shoulders came from strikes that never actually cut through the armor. The man lived, perhaps, but staggered, half-broken, easy prey for the next enemy. Leather and padded clothing were more common. They turned glancing cuts and softened lighter blows, but against steel they were little more than false hope. A sharp spear went straight through. A sword tore leather as easily as cloth. When the enemy pressed hard, these layers gave way like paper. And when armor failed, the battlefield changed. A man who once felt protected suddenly knew the terror of vulnerability. Blood sprayed, screams rose above the clash, and fear spread. Warriors faltered when they saw their brothers struck down despite their gear. Confidence shattered alongside shields. This was the grim truth. Armor never made a man invincible. It only bought him time. Time to strike first, time to live a few breaths longer, time to hope his comrades would hold the line. But once wood splintered, once iron bent, once leather tore, all that remained was flesh, and flesh has never withstood steel. The sagas rarely linger on these details. They speak of courage, of final words, of noble stands, but they do not describe the man clutching at the ruin of his face after his he. On the battlefield, one mistake could kill you not from an enemy's blade, but from your own feet. To fall in the shield wall was almost always a death sentence. The ground itself was treacherous. Mud churned by hundreds of boots became slick, sucking at sandals and greaves. Blood poured freely, mixing with dirt to create a sticky, slippery mire. Corpses piled beneath the living, their bodies tripping the men still fighting above. One stumble, one slip, and you were suddenly on your back, with the battle still raging overhead. The first danger was the enemy. A fallen man was an easy target. Spears drove down, swords stabbed low, and axes hacked into exposed limbs. But worse than the enemy was the weight of your own side. The shield wall pressed forward relentlessly, and those behind could not see or stop. Dozens of men, then hundreds, surged over the fallen. A man was crushed beneath the boots of his comrades, ribs snapping, air driven from his lungs, his screams drowned by the roar of battle. The panic of falling was unlike anything else. Men clawed at the ground, tried to drag themselves upright, only to feel boots slam into their heads, backs, and bellies. Shields smashed down unintentionally, pinning them further. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank into the chaos. Some begged for help, but in the press of men, there was no reaching down. Even friends and kin could do nothing but push forward, lest they fall themselves. Suffocation claimed many before the blade. Packed beneath bodies, air vanished quickly. Some died gasping in the dark, crushed under the combined weight of men, wood, and iron. Their deaths went unseen, their bodies discovered only when the field emptied, twisted, and flattened beneath layers of the fallen. This was the hidden horror of mass combat, the trample, the crush. A warrior could train for swordplay, for shield drills, for the clash of axes. But no amount of practice could save him once his feet slipped in blood. The shield wall was not a place for weakness. The ground showed no mercy. Even survivors carried the scars. Broken limbs, crushed chests, shattered jaws from being stomped. Some men crawled from beneath the dead, only to collapse from exhaustion and shock. Few ever fought again. The sagas speak of heroes cut down by blades, of noble deaths facing the foe, but they rarely tell of men who suffocated unseen or who screamed while their own brothers trampled them unknowingly into the mud. Yet, in truth, many more died this way than in shining duels. Falling was not dramatic, it was not glorious, it was silent panic, desperate clawing, and the slow, crushing weight of 100 marching men. On the battlefield, staying upright was as vital as holding your weapon, because once you went down, you almost never came back up. Long before a man saw the enemy, he smelled the battle. It hung thick in the air, clinging to every breath, impossible to escape. The first scent was sweat. Hundreds of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, locked in formation, their pores pouring out fear and effort. Men stank of unwashed flesh, of damp wool, of leather soaked through with days of marching. The shield wall was a furnace, and every breath tasted of another man's breath. Then came the iron tang of blood. It spattered across shields, sprayed from cut veins, oozed from crushed bodies underfoot. Fresh blood was sharp, metallic, almost sweet. But mixed with dirt and heat, it thickened into a sour stench that clung to skin and clothes. The ground became a reeking swamp of gore, soaking into boots, staining the earth black. Every step stirred it anew. Smoke often joined the air, drifting from burning huts or torches hurled onto the field. Wood smoke by itself was familiar, even comforting. But mingled with blood and sweat, it became acrid, choking, a haze that stung the eyes and coated the tongue. Sometimes it carried the charred stench of fleshmen burned alive in a hut or caught in fire traps, their bodies seared to ash. That smell could never be forgotten. And then there was death, the reek of open guts spilled onto the dirt, of bowels cut wide, of stomach acid and half-digested meals leaking into the mud. The stench turned men's stomachs, made them gag behind their shields. Worse still were the corpses left too long in the sun, bloating, splitting, crawling with flies. In the crush of war, men trampled over rotting bodies from earlier fights, their decay bursting underfoot, releasing waves of stench so foul it made eyes water. This was the unseen weapon of battle, the smell that broke men's minds before their bodies. Even hardened warriors gagged, their throats burning with bile, their heads swimming as the odours thickened. To breathe deeply was to choke. To hold one's breath was to falter. There was no escape. No saga sings of it. No tale describes how a man's nose filled with filth until he could taste it. Yet every warrior knew the truth, that battle was not only fought with steel and blood, but endured through the suffocating, nauseating stench of death itself. Those who survived carried the memory with them. Even years later, the faintest whiff of iron, the drift of smoke, or the rot of meat could drag them back to the battlefield in an instant. For some, the smell never left at all. It clung to their armour, their beards, their very skin, as though the battlefield had seeped into their bones. The smell of battle was not just a detail. It was the reminder that war was not heroic, but foul, filthy, and sickening. And for many, it was worse than the fear of the blade. If sight and smell made the battlefield real, it was sound that made it unbearable. The roar of battle was not just noise, it was a storm that swallowed thought, drowned fear, and turned men into animals. It began with the horns. Long before steel touched steel, the war horns blasted across the fields deep, bellowing calls that shook the chest. They were not music but commands, a language of sound that ordered men forward or signalled retreat. To hear the enemy's horns echoing back was like feeling the ground quake. It told every warrior they were coming. Then came the clash of iron. Shields slammed together like doors slamming in a hurricane. Spears struck wood with heavy, hollow thuds. Blades rang against helmets, sparks flying, a shrill screech that set teeth on edge. The pounding of weapons created a rhythm of violence, faster and faster, until it became an endless hammering in the ears. But louder still were the voices. Men shouted not from courage, but from terror and rage. They screamed to give themselves strength, to silence the pounding of their own hearts. They roared like beasts, curses spilling from cracked throats, their voices raw within minutes. Orders were shouted too, but in the din, they were lost, swallowed by the chaos. Few could hear their leaders. Most could only follow the man directly ahead, blind and deaf to all else. And beneath it all, a darker sound, the cries of the wounded. Some screamed in shrill panic as they were cut down. Others groaned low and long, their breath rattling out as life fled. Horses shrieked when cut open, a terrible, high-pitched sound that lingered long after. Those noises haunted survivors more than the clash of weapons, for they carried the human cost of every blow. The roar of battle was disorienting. Men lost sense of direction, unable to tell left from right, friend from foe. The thunder of feet stamping the earth, the clang of steel, the bellowing of lungs together, it became an unbroken wave of sound. To be in it was like standing in the heart of a storm, deafened and battered, with no escape. Even silence became terrifying. In rare moments when a clash ended, when men pulled back to breathe, the sudden absence of noise was worse than the noise itself. It left the ears ringing, the heart hammering in the emptiness, the mind waiting for the next crash to shatter it again. For warriors, sound was both weapon and curse. The roar of their own voices drove them forward, but the deafening storm of the battlefield stripped them of control. It reminded them that they were not individuals, but part of a tide, a mass that moved and killed as one. And when the fighting was over, the roar did not leave. Survivors carried it with them, ringing in their ears at night, haunting their dreams. Long after the steel was sheathed and the horns silent, the battlefield still roared inside their skulls. The shield wall was strength. As long as it held, men felt less like individuals and more like a single, unbreakable beast. Shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, they stood as one. But when that wall cracked, when the formation gave way, battle became something else entirely, chaos. The collapse rarely came all at once. It started with a gap, one man falling, tripping, or being driven back. His neighbours tried to close it, but in the crush, even a hand's width of space was enough. A spear darted in, a shield shoved deeper, and suddenly the line wavered. Panic spread faster than fire in dry grass. What had been an organised defence turned into a storm of individuals. Men no longer fought as one, they fought for themselves. Shields turned sideways, some dropped entirely. Warriors spun in circles, trying to defend from blows on every side. The wall had been a front, now it was a whirlpool. The enemy surged through the opening like water through a burst dam. Once inside, they spread wide, striking at backs, cutting down men who moments earlier had been safe. The press of bodies became unbearable, no longer shoulder to shoulder, but chest to chest, face to face. There was no room to swing properly. Axes hacked downward, stabbing knives found gaps in armour, Fists and teeth even joined the fight. Confusion reigned, orders vanished. A man might turn and find himself staring at a familiar face, only to realize too late it was a friend, not a foe. In the madness, allies struck each other down, blinded by fear and noise. The field became a slaughterhouse of mistakes. Some tried to flee, but flight was almost impossible. To turn your back was to open your spine to the enemy's blade. Men stumbled over corpses, tripped on broken shields, fell into the mud, only to be trampled by the living. For those who fell, there was little chance of rising again. The strongest warriors sometimes fought on alone, back to back, fending off attackers until exhaustion dragged them down. Others dropped their weapons, raising hands in surrender, but mercy was rare. In the fury of a broken line, few enemies paused to spare lives. Most cut down the helpless, with the same frenzy as they struck the armed. It was here, in the breaking, that battles were truly decided, not in the clash of shield walls, not in the steady exchange of blows, but in the moment when order dissolved into chaos. A commander's power ended, a warrior's training shattered, and only raw survival remained. The sagas would later sing of brave last stands and noble deaths, but the truth was uglier. When formations broke, there was no glory, only panic, confusion, and slaughter. For those who lived, the memory was carved deep, the moment when the wall crumbled, when the army became a mob, and when war revealed its most brutal face. When the chaos settled, when the shield walls had shattered, and the survivors stood gasping in the mud, the battlefield turned from combat to judgment. The question hung heavy in the air: who would be shown mercy, and who would be left to die? In truth, mercy was a rare coin in Viking warfare. Battles were not tournaments of honor, but brutal struggles for survival and dominance. A man who surrendered was often more valuable dead than alive. Killing him ensured he would never rise again, never seek revenge, never call on kin to reclaim honor. To spare him was a risk few warriors wished to take. Those who fell wounded faced an even darker fate. A man lying in the mud, clutching a torn belly or a broken leg, was unlikely to see compassion. More often, a spear thrust ended his suffering or silenced his cries before they drew attention. Some enemies laughed as they finished the wounded, mocking them for weakness. Others struck quickly, without words, treating it as a grim necessity. To leave them alive was to leave a future enemy. And yet, not all mercy was absent. Occasionally, warriors were captured instead of killed if they were valuable. A wealthy man, a noble, or someone from a family with influence could be ransomed. These captives were spared not from kindness, but from profit. Shackled and beaten, they would live long enough to fetch silver. For them, survival was humiliation, not relief. There were also moments, rare and fleeting, when mercy came from personal choice. A warrior might spare a man he recognized, or let a boy flee, unwilling to stain his sword with the blood of youth. Some spared enemies out of exhaustion, too tired to lift their weapon one more time. But these were exceptions, not rules. Among the Norse, there was no universal code demanding mercy. The sagas tell of warriors who granted quarter, but they also tell of mass killings, of fields where no one was spared. Mercy depended on the mood of the victors, the value of the defeated, and the fury still burning in men's veins after the clash. For the survivors, the memory of that choice lingered. Those who had been spared carried gratitude mixed with shame, knowing their lives had hung on the edge of another man's will. Those who had shown mercy sometimes regretted it, fearing the spared man would one day return, blade in hand. And for the dead, there was silence. No saga sang for those cut down while begging for life. No poets carved verses for the nameless wounded who bled into the soil. On the battlefield, mercy was not a virtue, it was a gamble. And most men, in the heat of victory, preferred certainty, the certainty of death. When the chaos settled, when the shield walls had shattered, and the survivors stood gasping in the mud, the battlefield turned from combat to judgment. The question hung heavy in the air: who would be shown mercy and who would be left to die? In truth, mercy was a rare coin in Viking warfare. Battles were not tournaments of honor, but brutal struggles for survival and dominance. A man who surrendered was often more valuable dead than alive. Killing him ensured he would never rise again, never seek revenge, never call on kin to reclaim honor. To spare him was a risk few warriors wished to take. Those who fell wounded faced an even darker fate. A man lying in the mud, clutching a torn belly or a broken leg, was unlikely to see compassion. More often, a spear thrust ended his suffering or silenced his cries before they drew attention. Some enemies laughed as they finished the wounded, mocking them for weakness. Others struck quickly, without words, treating it as a grim necessity. To leave them alive was to leave a future enemy. And yet, not all mercy was absent. Occasionally, warriors were captured instead of killed if they were valuable. A wealthy man, a noble, or someone from a family with influence could be ransomed. These captives were spared not from kindness, but from profit. Shackled and beaten, they would live long enough to fetch silver. For them, survival was humiliation, not relief. There were also moments, rare and fleeting, when mercy came from personal choice. A warrior might spare a man he recognized, or let a boy flee, unwilling to stain his sword with the blood of youth. Some spared enemies out of exhaustion, too tired to lift their weapon one more time. But these were exceptions, not rules. Among the Norse, there was no universal code demanding mercy. The sagas tell of warriors who granted quarter, but they also tell of mass killings, of fields where no one was spared. Mercy depended on the mood of the victors, the value of the defeated, and the fury still burning in men's veins after the clash. For the survivors, the memory of that choice lingered. Those who had been spared carried gratitude mixed with shame, knowing their lives had hung on the edge of another man's will. Those who had shown mercy sometimes regretted it, fearing the spared man would one day return, blade in hand. And for the dead, there was silence. No saga sang for those cut down while begging for life. No poets carved verses for the nameless wounded who bled into the soil. On the battlefield, mercy was not a virtue, it was a gamble. And most men, in the heat of victory, preferred certainty, the certainty of death. When the smoke cleared and generations passed, Viking battles did not remain as they truly were. The mud, the terror, the stink of blood, and the chaos faded from memory. What survived instead were stories, sagas, crafted by poets, sung beside firelight, carved into memory like runes upon stone. The sagas remembered bravery, not panic. They spoke of warriors standing firm in shield walls, of fearless champions cutting through foes, of gods watching from the skies. The trembling knees, the vomit before battle, the cries of the dying, these were silenced. In their place rose tales of glory, honor, and fate. This transformation was no accident. Men needed to believe the struggle meant something greater. Fathers wanted their sons to think them heroes, not frightened survivors. Kings needed poets to turn bloody victories into legends of divine favor. And so the raw truth of battle was buried beneath layers of myth, polished until it gleamed like a sword in sunlight. Yet the scars remained in silence. The land kept its memory. Farmers ploughed bones from the earth long after battles ended, grim reminders of what really happened. Old warriors carried nightmares to their graves, waking in sweat at the echo of screams. They did not tell those stories to their children. Instead, they nodded when skalds sang of Odin's chosen, and smiled when their grandsons raised wooden swords, eager to chase glory. The legacy of Viking battle, then, is double-edged. On one side is the myth-noble sagas of shield maidens, fearless warriors, and men who laughed in the face of death. On the other is the reality chaos, fear, exhaustion, and survival at any cost. Both are true, and both shape the people who lived in that age. Even now, centuries later, when we think of Vikings, we do not picture men vomiting from nerves or breaking beneath the weight of fear. We see them as legends, larger than life, eternal in their strength. The myth has triumphed over the memory. But beneath that myth lies the truth, waiting in the silence of old battlefields, in the bones beneath the soil. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Battle was not glorious, but memory made it so. The men who fought were not gods, but ordinary flesh and blood, terrified and brutal, merciful and merciless. To know what actually happened in a Viking battle is to strip away the poetry and face the human reality. War was chaos, and survival itself was victory. The sagas sing of glory, the earth whispers of horror. Between them lies the legacy of Viking battle,